The CT100 mobile phone is on sale now for only $899.
Announcing a revolutionary new discovery about the seatbelt.
They gave our cars a personality that made driving feel human, not machine-made. Now, they've vanished without a trace. What happened to the strange little features that once made every ride unforgettable? Swiveling front seats were once the gold standard of convenience and cool. Found in luxury rides like the Chrysler Cordoba in the 1970s, they turned outward to meet you like an old friend, easing your entry with a graceful pivot. You did not slide into these cars. You were invited in. It was a smooth, cinematic motion that made drivers feel like captains boarding their ships. Passengers loved it. No awkward scooting, no twisted backs, just a simple turn and sit. But as crash safety standards evolved, so did the rules. Swiveling seats suddenly became liabilities. They struggled to meet modern anchoring regulations and airbag placement standards. Engineers tried to make them safer, but the mechanisms added weight and complexity. Eventually, they were deemed too risky, too expensive, and quietly phased out. What began as a glamorous welcome gesture ended as a forgotten hazard of the past. Today's cars may have heated seats and lumbar support, but none of them turn to greet you anymore. There was a time when nearly every passenger had their own cigarette lighter and ashtray, even in the backseat doors. It was not just a feature, it was a lifestyle. Smoking in cars was once so normalized, so ingrained in everyday life, that manufacturers built it into the car's DNA. The lighter clicked to life with a satisfying push, and a tiny spiral coil lit up like a beacon. Ashtrays were tucked into armrests and consoles, waiting patiently for a flick of ashes. In luxury sedans, everyone had their own. No need to ask, no need to share. But times changed. As smoking declined and health awareness grew, these features went from classy to concerning. Ashtrays turned into storage bins. Lighters disappeared altogether. What was once a sign of sophistication became a reminder of just how different things used to be. Today, most cars have a single 12-volt socket, and most drivers use it to charge their phones. The ritual of lighting a cigarette mid-drive, now a ghost in the door panel. Long before your steering wheel had buttons and stalks, the high beam switch was on the floor. That is right. Your left foot controlled the headlights. Press it once to flash. Press it again to blind every deer for miles. It was mechanical, satisfying, and a little clunky. But back then, it worked. Especially in trucks and sedans from the 1940s through the 1970s, the floor-mounted dimmer was just another part of driving. Drivers could adjust their lights without letting go of the wheel. It felt intuitive, until it did not. Dirt, rain, and salt wore down the switch fast. In winter, it might freeze. In summer, it might short out. Over time, steering column switches took over, more accessible, less exposed. Technology advanced, and safety won. But some folks still remember pressing that metal button with a steel-toed boot and lighting up the road like a runway. That switch might be gone, but its click still echoes in memories of night drives long past. Crank windows had soul. Every turn of the handle was a little act of control, a quiet, muscle-powered moment that connected you to your car. No motors, no buttons, just gears and your own effort. You could roll it down halfway for a cigarette, crack it a bit for ventilation, or spin it all the way open and let the wind slap you awake. There was resistance. There was rhythm. Kids would race to see who could crank theirs down first. But modern life wants speed and silence. Power windows arrived, and within a few decades, cranks were history. Today, it is rare to find a new car with manual windows. They live mostly in memory, and in a few stubborn base models of work trucks. The crank may be gone, but for many drivers, that satisfying clunk, clunk, clunk still lives in the back of their minds like a song they never meant to forget. Hideaway headlights were the peak of cool. One moment your car looked like a blank-faced beast. The next, it blinked awake, headlights popping out from nowhere like eyes under a mask. It was dramatic, futuristic, stylish. From the Chevrolet Corvette to the Mazda RX-7, these lights were a visual statement. But hidden lights had a hidden problem. They broke. Often. The motors jammed, the panels stuck. On cold mornings, one eye would rise while the other drooped like a winking zombie. And worse, they became a liability in crashes. Designers moved on. Aerodynamics and reliability took priority. What was once a signature feature became a costly annoyance. Today, those blinking eyes are gone. But if you ever saw a sports car squint awake at a green light, you know just how much personality we lost when hideaway headlights disappeared. Vent windows, sometimes called wing windows, were little triangular lifesavers. Located at the front corners of the car doors, they swung open to let fresh air rush in. Before air conditioning was standard, they were everything. Need a breeze without the roar of a rolled-down window? Just crack the vent. It let in air, pushed out cigarette smoke, and added a touch of freedom to every ride. They felt clever, compact, almost magical. But they also leaked. Rain got in, wind noise got loud, and thieves loved them, an easy break-in point. By the 1980s, vent windows were fading fast. Designers favored sleek, unbroken glass. Climate control took over. And just like that, the charming little triangle became a casualty of progress. But those who drove with a wing window cracked open on a warm night? They remember how sweet, simple airflow used to be. Opera windows were all about looks. Small, oval, or square glass inserts on the side of the roof, usually behind the rear seats. They did not open and they did not do much. But in the 1970s, they were everywhere. Found on personal luxury coupes like the Lincoln Continental and the Chrysler New Yorker, they gave cars an air of elegance and mystery. You could not see much through them. They barely let in light. But they looked like something out of a movie, a secret window to a world of velvet interiors and vinyl roofs. These little glass panels did not offer function. They offered fantasy. They suggested something refined, almost romantic, like you were not just driving, you were arriving. And for many drivers, that was enough. These windows turned heads, added flair, and made your car feel like a private carriage dressed for the opera house. Yet with time, the illusion faded. By the 1980s, drivers wanted performance, aerodynamics, and cleaner silhouettes. The flashy extras were trimmed down, and opera windows were among the first to go. They were costly to produce, difficult to integrate into evolving body styles, and did not offer any real benefit beyond aesthetics. Designers moved on, and so did the world. Today, they are rarely seen, but if you ever spot one glinting on a classic car, it is like catching a ghost of 1970s glamour still riding down the highway. A silent echo of a time when form truly triumphed over function. Automatic seat belts sounded like a brilliant idea. Close the door, and a motorized belt would glide along a track and strap across your chest. No need to buckle up, it buckled for you. It was part safety, part science fiction. Popular in the late 1980s and early 1990s, they were supposed to increase seatbelt usage in a time when people still ignored them. These systems were installed to meet government safety regulations without requiring airbags, at least not yet. But there was a catch. The shoulder belt moved automatically, but the lap belt had to be buckled manually. Most people skipped it. That meant the safety system was incomplete and sometimes dangerous. If you were in an accident and the lap belt was not secured, the chest belt alone could cause serious injuries. Malfunctions were common. Belts jammed, motors failed, and the entire mechanism became more of a hassle than a help. Drivers complained, passengers rolled their eyes, even insurance companies began questioning their effectiveness. Eventually, airbags became mandatory and offered a more complete form of protection. These robotic belts, once seen as a marvel, were quietly phased out. What was meant to save lives became an awkward footnote in automotive history, a strange in-between stage during a time of transition. Today, very few people remember them fondly, but those who do remember the feeling of being strapped in by their own car like something out of a futuristic cartoon. Hand choke knobs were the kind of thing that made you feel like a mechanic every time you started your car. Before electronic fuel injection, cold mornings meant fiddling with a little knob on the dash. Pull it out to enrich the fuel mix. Push it in once the engine warmed up. It was simple, but it required feel. Too much choke and you flooded the engine. Too little and the car would stall. Drivers learned to listen, to sense when it was just right. It made every ignition feel personal, like a handshake between you and the machine. For many, it was a morning ritual, one more step in the dance of daily life. You had to know your car. You had to understand its mood. Starting it was not just about turning a key. It was a relationship. But technology moved on. Carburetors gave way to fuel injection, which gave way to computer-controlled systems that adjusted everything for you. Suddenly, the driver was no longer in charge of the mix. Engines became smarter, more efficient, and far less hands-on. The choke knob disappeared, and while most drivers welcomed the ease of modern ignitions, some missed the tactile connection. That little knob, now extinct, was a symbol of a time when starting your car meant you were part of the machine, not just a passenger along for the ride. Built-in tissue dispensers were the final touch of class in certain 1950s and 1960s American cars. Found in Cadillacs, Lincolns, and other luxury models, they were often tucked into the dashboard or the glove box area, offering a neat little pull-out slot for tissues. It was not about sneezing, it was about style, clean lines, thoughtful design, and a world where even your tissues had a home. These dispensers were not afterthoughts. They were deliberate. They matched the upholstery, aligned with the dash design, and offered one more reason to feel like your car had everything. Some even came with branded tissues that matched the vehicle. It was part of a bigger trend in that era. Cars were not just machines, they were personal sanctuaries, a place of comfort, elegance, and care. But by the 1970s, they disappeared. They took up space. Tissues got smaller. Drivers carried their own boxes. Designers cut the frills to focus on function. Luxury was redefined, and small niceties like tissue dispensers faded out. Today, nobody expects a factory-installed Kleenex tray. But that old feature whispered something about the values of its time: comfort, detail, and care for the little things. It said, "You deserve softness, even on the road." That sentiment may be gone from dashboards, but for some, the memory of a neatly slotted tissue remains as gentle and thoughtful as the cars that once carried them. Fender-mounted turn signal indicators were once a small but genius addition to your dashboard visibility. Tiny illuminated arrows, often mounted right on the front fenders, let the driver know when a blinker was on, even when road noise or sunlight made it hard to hear or see from inside. It was like your car giving you a visual nod, confirming, yes, your signal is still blinking. Back in the 1950s and 1960s, this was more than a design flourish. It was functional peace of mind. Especially helpful during long highway drives or in noisy environments, these indicators glowed softly, telling you if you had forgotten to cancel your turn signal. But as dashboard displays evolved and turn signal mechanisms became more sophisticated, fender indicators lost their place. People started relying on internal cues, clicking sounds, blinking dash lights. The little arrows outside became redundant. Plus, they added to manufacturing complexity and cost. Eventually, car makers dropped them in favor of cleaner fender lines and less clutter on the body. Yet for drivers who grew up with them, fender signals were a small touch that made a big difference. A quiet, constant reminder that sometimes the simplest features are the ones you miss the most. Car phones bolted to the center console were once the pinnacle of cool. In the 1980s and early 1990s, having a phone in your car was not about convenience, it was about status. Businessmen, real estate agents, and flashy socialites all wanted one. They were heavy, bulky, and often connected by thick, coiled cords. The phone itself looked like a miniature brick with an antenna sticking out the top, mounted in the middle of the car like it was a throne. These phones rarely worked well. Calls dropped constantly, and signal strength was unreliable unless you were in a major city. The cost was outrageous too, with installation fees, monthly charges, and per-minute rates that made even a short call feel like a luxury. But that was the point. It was never really about the conversation. It was about being seen. Pulling up in traffic with one hand on the wheel and the other holding a car phone? That was the move. It screamed success. But like most tech trends, it faded fast. As mobile phones became smaller, cheaper, and more powerful, these bolted-down relics looked downright primitive. By the late 1990s, the car phone was history, replaced by the very devices that once copied its swagger. Retractable radio antennas were like little magic wands that announced your car was ready to rock. The moment you turned on the radio, you would hear that soft electric hum, and up came the thin silver antenna, rising proudly from the fender. It was theatrical, precise, and oddly satisfying. Some even retracted with a gentle swoosh when you turned the car off, as if tucking itself in for the night. For decades, these antennas were standard on everything from sedans to sports cars. They brought in clearer signals and looked sleeker than those stiff, permanent rods. But the magic came with problems. They were fragile. One wrong car wash or accidental bump, and the whole thing bent or snapped. Worse, the motors would wear out. You would get half an antenna or one stuck halfway. And in cold weather, forget it. Eventually, fixed stubby antennas and embedded window wires took over. They were more durable, less flashy, and got the job done. But for those who remember the ritual, the rise, the fall, the gentle hum, retractable antennas were more than functional. They had personality, a kind of mechanical grace that made turning on the radio feel like unlocking a small ceremony. Map lights with manual switches were once a co-pilot's best friend. Before GPS, before digital screens, before you could ask your phone to take you home, people relied on paper maps. And when the sun went down, those maps became hard to read. Enter the map light, a small, focused bulb mounted in just the right spot, often above the glove compartment or embedded in the rearview mirror housing. It had its own switch, separate from the dome light, so you could turn it on without flooding the cabin with glare. For long road trips, it was essential. The passenger could trace routes, check exits, or fold and unfold maps without distracting the driver. Some models even had dimmers to protect night vision. But as navigation changed, so did the need. GPS units with backlit screens made paper maps obsolete. Smartphones finished the job. The manual map light? Forgotten. Today's interiors have ambient lighting and digital displays, but few still offer a dedicated map light. For those who drove before the touchscreen era, that little lamp meant control and confidence. A small glowing beacon in the dark that helped you figure out where you were and where you were going. Curb feelers were the kind of feature that looked silly but saved your car. Thin metal wires or spring-loaded arms attached near the wheel wells, they hung low and stuck out just enough to scrape the curb before your tires did. That scraping sound was your signal. You were too close. In the 1950s and 1960s, when white-wall tires and gleaming hubcaps were everything, curb feelers kept those expensive rims pristine. They made parallel parking easier. They gave new drivers a bit of confidence. Sure, they looked like whiskers, and yes, they sometimes made an embarrassing screech when you parked. But they worked. Unfortunately, they also broke easily. They rattled. They rusted. And as design evolved, they started to clash with the cleaner lines of modern cars. Electronic parking sensors and backup cameras arrived and made feelers obsolete. But some old-school drivers still swear by them, especially on classic cars. Because while your modern car might beep at you, curb feelers spoke with a scratch. And for those who remember them, that sound was a weird kind of comfort. Dashboard clocks that needed winding were a relic from a more hands-on era. Built right into the dash, they looked like miniature wristwatches with little crowns for adjusting time. These clocks did not rely on electricity or batteries. They ran on gears, springs, and your effort. Drivers would wind them every few days, turning the knob with care, making sure the ticking stayed steady. It was one more small responsibility, like checking oil or adjusting mirrors. But the clocks often lost time. A minute here, a minute there, until suddenly you were 5 minutes late. In winter, they slowed down. In summer, they sped up. But people kept them wound anyway. Because it felt right. It felt civilized. Like your car was not just a machine, it was a companion that needed attention. Eventually, electric clocks took over, then digital ones. And now, most people just glance at their phones. But there was something about seeing the second hand sweep across that tiny face, set into polished wood or chrome, that made a car feel alive. A winding clock was not perfect, but it was personal. A little ritual in a dashboard full of knobs and gauges. Chain steering wheel locks were the brute force solution to a problem that kept growing: car theft. Before smart keys, chip-based immobilizers, or GPS tracking systems, people relied on cold, hard steel to protect their vehicles. These devices were simple: a long, heavy metal bar or chain that attached across the steering wheel and locked into place. Some versions also connected to the brake pedal or seat frame, making steering virtually impossible unless removed. The most iconic of these devices was the club, which exploded in popularity during the 1990s. People would snap it on with a loud click, pocket the key, and walk away knowing that even if someone hot-wired their car, they could not get far. It was not elegant, it was not high-tech, but it worked. Still, these devices had flaws. They were clunky and could scuff or damage the steering wheel. The keys were easy to lose, and clever thieves eventually found workarounds, sawing through the steering wheel, freezing the lock mechanism, or simply being faster and more determined. But for years, these bars were a deterrent that gave drivers peace of mind. Today, cars come equipped with alarm systems, encrypted key fobs, and apps that can disable your car remotely. But in the days before digital security, there was nothing quite as reassuring as the cold, metallic barrier across your steering wheel, a symbol that you were not making it easy for anyone. Headlight dimmer sensors in the 1950s felt like something out of a futuristic comic book. Introduced by Cadillac and marketed as a premium luxury feature, these sensors were among the first automated systems built into cars. Mounted on the dashboard, a tiny phototube sensor would detect the headlights of oncoming vehicles and automatically dim your high beams. No need to reach for a switch. No need to take your hands off the wheel. Just smooth, courteous driving, at least in theory. The promise was elegance and safety rolled into one. But reality often lagged behind. The sensors were primitive by today's standards. Some were overly sensitive and dimmed at the wrong time. Others were not sensitive enough and failed to react. Reflections from signs and bright city lights could confuse the system, and many drivers found themselves constantly overriding it manually. Still, it was a bold idea, one that hinted at what cars would someday become. The technology may have been clunky and unreliable back then, but it laid the foundation for today's advanced driver assistance systems. Modern vehicles now boast headlight automation powered by sensors, cameras, and computers with much greater accuracy and efficiency. But it all began with that humble phototube in a 1950s Cadillac. Even if it dimmed the lights at the worst possible time, it represented a moment when cars started to think for themselves, an early spark in the long road to smart driving. Column shifters, affectionately known as three on the tree, were once a defining feature of American driving. Instead of a gear lever between the front seats, these shifters were mounted directly on the steering column just behind the wheel. With a simple upward or downward flick, drivers could move smoothly through 3 forward gears and reverse. The design freed up floor space, allowing for wide, uninterrupted bench seats up front. This meant that 3 people could ride comfortably across the front row, driver, passenger, and the kid or teenager squeezed in the middle. In family sedans and pickup trucks alike, this setup was everywhere from the 1940s to the 1970s. It made road trips cozier and everyday commutes feel more social. But over time, column shifters started to show their age. The linkage often wore out, causing sticky shifts or misaligned gears. As performance became a selling point and sporty interiors became fashionable, floor-mounted shifters took over. They looked cooler, felt tighter, and fit better with center consoles and other tech-heavy features. Column shifters quietly faded from mainstream models, surviving only in a few utilitarian trucks and vintage rides. Today, they are a charming throwback to a time when simplicity ruled and cars made room for closeness. Those who remember them can still picture sliding across that wide seat, shifting into gear with a confident snap of the wrist, and hitting the road with nothing but open highway and easy conversation ahead. Bench seats in the front row were the living room couch of the road. Wide, padded, and built for togetherness, they could seat 3 people across without fuss. No gaps, no armrests, just one continuous stretch of comfort. Families loved them. Teenagers on dates loved them even more. You could slide from one side to the other, pass snacks, or lean over for a nap. For decades, they were the default in American cars, especially full-size sedans and trucks. But they came with compromises. No real support for curves or bumps, no cup holders, no space for fancy tech. As car interiors evolved and center consoles took over, bench seats started to feel outdated. Safety standards also demanded separate seat belts and airbags for every passenger, which bench seats struggled to support. Slowly, they disappeared. Today, you will only find them in a handful of trucks, and even those are becoming rare. But if you ever sat in the middle seat up front, arm pressed against your sibling, radio humming through a single dash speaker, you know bench seats were more than furniture. They were a part of the journey. Rear-facing third-row seats were a special kind of thrill for kids growing up in station wagons. While the adults looked forward, eyes on the road, the lucky ones in the back row sat in their own little world, facing backwards. There was something mischievous and magical about it. You could wave at strangers, make faces at the drivers behind you, or just watch the world unfold in reverse. It felt rebellious, like you had broken the rules of what car rides were supposed to be. Parents loved it because it added extra seating, but kids loved it because it turned every errand into an adventure. These seats were common in wagons from the 1960s through the 1980s, often folding up from the floor like a secret passageway. But they came with downsides. In rear-end collisions, they were less safe. The seating position was awkward for car seats. And as minivans and SUVs took over the market, the rear-facing bench lost its place. Today, they are all but extinct, but those who grew up back there remember the joy of pretending to drive in reverse, staring down trucks, and knowing you had the best seat in the car. Built-in ice scrapers in the wipers were one of those strange little features that felt like a great idea, until they were not. Found in some 1980s vehicles, these systems aimed to solve a real winter problem: frozen wiper blades. Some used heating elements built into the blades, while others used small metal edges or ridges that scraped the ice as the wipers moved. On paper, it was clever. No more jumping in the car and having to chip away at your windshield with frozen fingers. Drivers could hit a button, warm up the glass, and drive off with clear vision. But in practice, they struggled. The heating elements were weak and prone to failure. The little scraper ridges wore down quickly. And worse, if the system malfunctioned, it could actually scratch the windshield or burn out entirely. Over time, drivers turned to better solutions, like heated mirrors, defroster grids, and improved all-weather wiper blades. They promised a quick fix for brutal winter mornings, offering drivers a high-tech solution to frozen wipers and icy windshields. But more often than not, they just became another unreliable gadget, burning out, scratching the glass, or failing when you needed them most. In the end, a good old-fashioned scraper and some patience outperformed the very system meant to replace them. Today, built-in scrapers have disappeared, but the memory of trying to beat the ice with a wiper alone still lingers for anyone who spent winters battling frozen glass and bitter cold starts. Underdash record players were Chrysler's ambitious attempt to bring vinyl records to the road with a feature called Highway Hi-Fi. It sounded like something out of a dream, your favorite records spinning beneath the dash while you cruised along the highway. But dreams and potholes do not mix. The idea debuted in the mid-1950s, promising a premium music experience that went far beyond the crackle of AM radio. The system used special 7-inch records with longer playtimes, designed specifically to handle some of the road's roughness. But even with heavy tone arms and spring-mounted players, bumps and vibrations still caused skipping. Changing records while driving was a safety hazard in itself, and the whole setup took up valuable space under the dashboard. Add in the fact that you could not play regular LPs, and you had a system that was both limited and fragile. It did not take long for tape players and eventually compact discs to offer better alternatives. Today, the highway hi-fi is a charming relic, part of a brief moment when we tried to blend old-school sound with the freedom of the open road, one wobbling record at a time. Pneumatic suspension leveling systems once felt like futuristic wizardry. Using compressed air to raise or lower the ride height, these systems promised a smooth, balanced drive no matter the load. Whether your trunk was empty or filled with suitcases, the car would adjust itself to stay level. Luxury brands embraced it in the 1970s and 1980s, pitching it as a perfect ride every time. And for a while, it worked. The sensation of floating down the highway on air was genuinely impressive, but the systems were delicate. Airbags leaked, compressors failed, valves clogged, repairs were expensive, and many cars sagged visibly as the system aged. In cold weather, the airlines could freeze. In hot weather, components wore out faster. Eventually, reliability concerns outweighed the comfort benefits. Modern suspensions use improved electronic controls and adaptive dampers, which are more efficient and less prone to failure. But there was something special about that self-leveling hum, the quiet hiss of air, and the idea that your car could breathe its way into balance. Pneumatic suspension is not completely gone, but its early forms are now more memory than reality. The Chevrolet Chevelle. Laguna had two sides. One was a family car, roomy and reliable with smooth lines and a comfortable ride. The other side? A NASCAR contender that raced under the bright lights and roaring crowds. In its early years, the Laguna looked like a practical upgrade to the Chevelle line, but its bold front-end styling and aerodynamic tweaks gave it a secret sporty edge. It was a car that tried to balance performance with practicality, and for a time, it pulled it off. Drivers appreciated the quiet strength of its V8 engine and the smooth handling on the highway. But as regulations tightened and fuel costs rose, its power started to feel excessive. Performance was choked down. The excitement dulled, and eventually, the Laguna was absorbed back into the sea of forgettable family sedans. Still, those who had one remember the thrill. It was the family car that secretly wanted to race, the weekday commuter with a weekend soul. And even though it vanished quietly by the end of the decade, the Laguna lives on in garage posters, race photos, and the stories of those who once pushed it to the limit. The 1980 Dodge Aspen and Plymouth Volare were holdovers from the previous decade, and by the 1980s, they were embarrassments. Built on aging platforms and clinging to outdated design, these cars were already struggling when the new decade rolled in. Known for catastrophic rust problems, failing suspensions, and erratic quality control, the Aspen and Volare had earned a bad reputation even before the first 1980 models rolled off the line. Dodge and Plymouth tried to extend their lifespans with cosmetic tweaks, new grills, paint schemes, maybe an optional trim package, but the core problems never went away. Engines sputtered and stalled. Carburetors needed constant adjustment. The interiors, filled with brittle plastics and peeling vinyl, degraded faster than the warranty expired. Road noise was loud, steering was vague, and every mile felt like a negotiation with fate. Meanwhile, Japanese imports were getting better every year, more reliable, more efficient, and far more modern. Buyers could feel how far behind they were just sitting in the driver's seat. Still, Chrysler seemed unwilling to admit defeat. Advertising promised value and tradition, but the truth was hard to hide. Eventually, they had no choice. The Aspen and Volare were quietly retired, two relics of a time the industry wanted to forget. Today, they rarely show up at car shows, auctions, or nostalgia pages, because unlike some failures that inspire affection, these ones just wore out their welcome. The 1971 Buick GSX Stage 1 was the kind of muscle car that wore a tie to the fight and still knocked you out in the first round. Buick had a reputation for smooth, luxurious rides, cars built for long cruises and quiet comfort. But the GSX flipped that script without tearing it up. Under the hood sat the Stage 1 455 cubic inch V8, a torque-heavy powerhouse that quietly outperformed some of the loudest names in the game. With well over 500 pound-feet of torque, it could flatten your spine at a stoplight. Yet it did all this without screaming for attention. The GSX came in two standout colors, Saturn Yellow and Apollo White, both with bold racing stripes, rear spoilers, and blacked-out grills. It looked sharp, not showy. Inside, it was all Buick. Soft bucket seats, full instrumentation, and just enough wood trim to remind you that you were not in a stripped-down street racer. But when you dropped the hammer, everything changed. It was fast, refined, and completely intimidating when it needed to be. The GSX Stage 1 did not need gimmicks. It was a high-class assassin on wheels. Today, it is remembered as one of the most underrated muscle cars of the era. It proved that luxury and performance were not opposites, and that a little elegance could still tear up the pavement when the time was right. Sometimes the real threat is the one that stays quiet until you are already in the rear view. The Oldsmobile Omega tried to be something it was not, a luxury car wrapped in a compact body. As part of GM's X-Body platform, it shared bones with the Chevrolet Nova, Pontiac Ventura, and Buick Apollo. But Oldsmobile gave it extra touches: padded vinyl, better trim, and a fancier badge. For buyers who wanted a touch of class without a big price tag, the Omega hit a sweet spot. It was quiet, comfortable, and dependable, if not exactly thrilling. The name itself suggested mystery and finality, but the car played it safe. And in doing so, it quietly filled the driveways of suburban neighborhoods across America. It was the car of second jobs, Sunday errands, and high school parking lots. But that low-key presence meant it never made a lasting splash. By the end of the decade, newer designs and more exciting options made it easy to overlook. Yet for the people who drove them, the Omega was steady and familiar. It may not have wowed the world, but it never needed to. The 1986 Pontiac 6000 STE AWD was the future according to Pontiac. Digital dash, all-wheel drive, electronic everything. On paper, it was packed with features no other sedan in its class could touch. But in practice, it was a complicated, unreliable mess. The electronics glitched, the AWD system was clunky, and repairs were expensive. Drivers who expected high-tech harmony were met with blinking warnings and mechanical headaches. Pontiac billed the 6000 STE as a European-style performance sedan, but it had none of the refinement. It felt heavy. It felt overworked. It felt like technology running just ahead of its own understanding. While it did offer all-wheel drive in an era that was still new to the idea, it lacked the polish and consistency needed to make that innovation stick. The 6000 STE was not a total failure, but it came too soon and delivered too little. The 1970 Pontiac GTO Judge was loud, brash, and unapologetically bold. It was not just a muscle car, it was a declaration. With its outrageous color schemes, massive decals, and raucous engine growl, the Judge made sure nobody missed its arrival. Under the hood, it packed the Ram Air 3 or the optional Ram Air 4 V8, both offering blistering performance. The name itself came from a comedy routine, but the car was dead serious. It was built for the young, the wild, and the fearless. And it delivered. It could tear down a quarter-mile with ease, and the handling was tight enough to carve corners without flinching. Every inch of the Judge was designed to turn heads, from the Endura front bumper to the rear spoiler. It shouted muscle in a world where cars were starting to play it safe. And while the GTO had already earned its reputation by the late 1960s, the Judge pushed it into mythic territory. This was the version everyone remembers. This was the one people still talk about. It was performance wrapped in personality, and personality wrapped in power. Today, the Judge is missed not just because of how it drove, but because of what it represented, the height of muscle car confidence before everything got quieter. The Chevrolet Monza. 2+2 was a fastback with dreams bigger than its time allowed. Inspired by the sleek shapes of the Corvette, it carried curvy lines, low-profile styling, and the promise of performance. And with an optional V8 under the hood, it could deliver. For a brief moment, it looked like Chevrolet had found a sweet spot between compact practicality and sports car thrill. But then, the reality of the era hit hard. Smog regulations choked performance, safety demands weighed it down, and the same V8 that once excited buyers began to feel sluggish under pressure. Still, the Monza 2+2 had a style all its own. It turned heads with its dramatic angles and offered something that felt different from the boxier compacts around it. Car lovers remember the feeling of sitting low to the ground, looking out over that long, sloping hood. The car whispered rebellion, even if the engine could only manage a mutter. It did not last long, but the Monza 2+2 remains a symbol of ambition. What happens when big ideas meet hard limitations? And sometimes, even half-speed dreams are worth remembering. The 1980 Chevrolet Citation was General Motors' first big push into front-wheel drive, an effort to modernize its lineup and fight off foreign competition. But the launch was rushed, and the cracks showed almost immediately. Brake failures, rusted bodies, suspensions that collapsed under pressure, transmission issues dogged the early models, and misaligned steering columns made handling feel like guesswork. The Citation came out strong in sales, but quickly earned a reputation for unreliability. It was boxy, yes, but that was not the problem. The problem was that it felt unfinished. Cheap materials, inconsistent quality, and a driving experience that never inspired confidence. GM had marketed it as innovative, practical, and perfectly American. But buyers soon found themselves stuck with cars that shuddered, squeaked, and stalled. Lawsuits piled up, recalls followed, and the goodwill dried up fast. It even became a punchline in late-night comedy, symbolizing Detroit's worst instincts. What should have been a new chapter for Chevrolet became a footnote of frustration. The Citation did not just fail, it taught an entire generation not to trust promises stamped in chrome. The 1973 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am S D455 was a final roar before the silence. By the early 1970s, emissions rules, fuel prices, and insurance rates were all tightening the noose around muscle cars. But Pontiac pushed back. Hard. The Super Duty 455 engine was a masterpiece, hand-assembled, high compression, and packed with race-ready components. It was the most powerful engine of its time, hidden under the screaming chicken decal and aggressive bodywork. The Trans Am was still loud, still fast, still fighting. It had all the style, wheel flares, shaker hood, rear spoiler, and the strength to back it up. This was not a car built for compromise. It was built as a final statement, one last stand for raw American horsepower before the curtain dropped. Drivers who got their hands on one knew they were holding a piece of history even then. And today, it is seen as one of the last true muscle cars of the golden era. The SD455 was not just an engine. It was a farewell letter written in burnt rubber and roaring exhaust. The Plymouth Volare came in with high hopes and bold promises. Meant to replace the beloved Valiant, it was Chrysler's answer to changing fuel economies and modern styling demands of the mid-1970s. On paper, it looked like a step forward. It had a boxy, confident shape with a comfortable interior and plenty of trim options. For families wanting a solid, affordable ride with just a hint of flair, the Volare seemed perfect. It even won Motor Trend's Car of the Year in its debut. But under that promise, problems were waiting. Rust became a major issue. The suspension was clunky, reliability dropped fast, and recalls started stacking up. What was supposed to be Chrysler's new star faded before the decade even ended. Yet if you grew up in the 1970s, chances are you rode in one. Maybe it was the carpool ride to school or the wagon used on summer road trips. The Volare tried hard to keep up with the times, but the times moved faster. Still, its short-lived fame made it unforgettable for those who lived it. A memory boxed in steel and chrome, long gone but never fully erased. The 1985 Yugo GF made headlines as the cheapest new car in America. But cheap came with a price, and the Yugo paid dearly. Built in the former Yugoslavia and imported with bold promises, it was meant to give cost-conscious buyers an entry into car ownership. But almost everything about the Yugo felt like a compromise too far. The engine was noisy, the transmission clunky, and interior trim came loose with the slightest touch. Reviewers described it as toy-like, unstable, and barely roadworthy. On the highway, it struggled to keep up. On hills, it begged for mercy. Repairs were frequent and frustrating, and many new owners regretted the purchase before their first oil change. It became a late-night comedy punchline and the butt of every bad car joke for decades. Some cars fade into obscurity. The Yugo earned infamy. It proved that cutting costs without care leads to one destination: failure. The 1970 Oldsmobile 442W30 was a muscle car for people who knew exactly what they wanted. It was not flashy like some of its competitors. It did not have wild graphics or over-the-top styling. What it had was performance, pure, deliberate performance. The W30 package meant a ram air hood, fiberglass scoops, high-output camshaft, and serious internal upgrades. Under the hood sat a 455 cubic inch V8 that churned out brutal torque and ran hard through every gear. This was a street fighter in a suit. It looked mature, but underneath it was itching for a race. The 442 was all about balance. Power, sure, but also control. The suspension was tight. The brakes were solid. It felt like a full package, not just an engine with doors. And the W30 took all of that to the next level. Today, it is one of the most respected names in the muscle car world, not because it shouted the loudest, but because it delivered, day in, day out. For those who knew, it was the one to beat, and for those who drove one, it was never forgotten. The Chevrolet Vega had everything going for it. On paper, it was small, stylish, and exactly what American drivers were starting to want in the early 1970s. Fuel prices were rising. Imports were gaining ground. And here came the Vega, ready to prove that Detroit could build a compact car with style. Its long hood, clean lines, and two-door hatchback made it a real head-turner. It even won awards. But the problem started early. The innovative aluminum engine, meant to be lighter and more efficient, had overheating issues that warped the cylinders. The body was prone to rust, especially in snowy or salty climates. Owners who expected longevity were met with disappointment. Still, many people kept driving them. They were cheap, easy to handle, and for a lot of folks, the very first car they ever owned. The Vega may not have held up mechanically, but it left behind a different kind of legacy, one of optimism. It tried to be more than what it was allowed to be, and in its failure, it taught an entire generation about trade-offs, expectations, and the real meaning of brand loyalty. The Vega is gone, but in those who drove it, the memories still idle. The 1984 Ford EXP was supposed to be a sporty two-seater version of the Ford Escort, a compact car reimagined for young drivers looking for flair. But the EXP ended up with none of the performance and even less personality. The engine was weak, especially compared to the Sportier coupes coming out of Japan at the time. The handling was sluggish, the steering vague, and the road feel uninspired. For a car marketed as bold and different, it looked oddly dull. Ford tried hard to pitch it as a fun commuter car, sleek, affordable, and modern. But in reality, it felt more like a lonely Escort missing its back seat. It lacked excitement. It lacked buzz. Even the advertising could not figure out what the EXP was trying to be. Some versions added a turbo, but it was too little, too late. Consumers shrugged, sales tanked, and just a few years later, the model disappeared with barely a whisper. Even among Ford enthusiasts, the EXP has no cult following. The EXP was not a disaster because it did something wrong. It was a disaster because it never did anything right. It promised a thrill and delivered a yawn. The Dodge Dart Swinger was all attitude packed into a compact frame. While the base Dart was known as a sensible, dependable car, the Swinger trim brought something extra, something fun. It was a two-door coupe with just enough flash to make teenagers turn their heads and parents quietly shake theirs. The vinyl roof, racing stripes, and loud colors were made to stand out. It was not trying to be a muscle car, but it borrowed just enough swagger to feel like one. With engine options that gave it a little bite, the Swinger held its own on the road. Affordable, customizable, and easy to maintain, it quickly became a favorite among younger drivers. For a few golden years, it was everywhere, at drive-ins, outside burger joints, and lined up at local high schools. But as the 1970s wore on, tastes shifted. Insurance rates went up, gas prices soared, and the fun, flashy Swinger quietly disappeared. Still, it left its mark. It was a car that let regular people feel just a little cooler, a little faster, and a lot more alive. Those who drove it remember every ride, and those who missed out still wish they had taken the wheel. The 1981 Chevrolet El Camino was already nearing the end of its long and unusual life. A car-truck hybrid that once found favor with ranchers, handymen, and muscle car fans, the early 1980s versions had lost most of their edge. The styling felt dated, the powertrains were underwhelming, and the novelty had worn off. By 1981, it was clear the El Camino no longer fit in a changing market. Trucks were getting more refined, sedans were becoming more efficient, and the El Camino, once a clever compromise, just felt like a relic. Chevrolet did little to modernize it, instead coasting on nostalgia. The V8 engines had been detuned, the interiors were uninspired, and younger buyers were not interested in a car that looked like a mullet on wheels. Sales declined, dealerships gave up, and the El Camino quietly rolled into history just a few years later. Today, the earlier models still have a cult following, but the final years? They are mostly forgotten. Because by the 1980s, the El Camino was not bold, it was just tired. The 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle SS454 was not just a muscle car. It was a factory-built monster that growled with authority the second you touched the gas. At the heart of it was the LS6 engine, a big block brute that delivered 450 horsepower straight off the assembly line. That was unheard of at the time. It was raw, brutal torque packed into a mid-sized body that looked like it was always in motion, even when parked. The dual stripes, the cowl induction hood, and the rumble from those chrome-tipped exhaust pipes made the Chevelle impossible to ignore. It was the kind of car that made your palms sweat just sitting in the driver's seat. Quarter-mile times were legendary, and this car did not care about finesse, it was about dominance. People who drove it felt like kings, and those who lined up next to it at a red light, they usually regretted it. The Chevelle SS454 was the kind of car you saved all summer to buy, all winter to fix, and never stopped bragging about. It represented the peak of American muscle, before the rules changed and the power faded. Today, it is not just missed, it is worshipped. The AMC Hornet Sportabout was not just a station wagon, it was a style statement. Launched in the early 1970s, the Sportabout was AMC's answer to a world that needed utility, but craved flair. With its compact size and distinctive profile, it stood apart from the bulky wagons of the past. And then, in an unexpected twist, Gucci got involved. Yes, that Gucci. The fashion house teamed up with AMC to design a limited edition Sportabout complete with designer interiors, pinstriping, and branded badging. It was bold, it was bizarre, and it worked, at least for a little while. The Sportabout was reliable, versatile, and surprisingly fun to drive. Families loved it. Urban professionals appreciated the compact utility, but by the end of the 1970s, the wagon era was fading. SUVs were rising. Flash was no longer enough. Still, the Hornet Sportabout remains one of the few cars that can say it had real fashion cred. It may not be in museums or car shows, but in the memories of those who drove it, it is unforgettable. The 1983 Lincoln Continental Mark VI diesel was an answer to a question nobody asked. During the early 1980s oil crunch, Lincoln decided to offer a diesel version of its full-size luxury coupe. The result was predictably bizarre. Under the hood was a 5.7-liter V8 diesel borrowed from General Motors, and it sounded like a farm truck. Loud, slow, and unrefined. The acceleration was glacial. The engine shook the whole chassis, and the typical Lincoln smoothness was replaced with diesel rattle and hesitation. Worse, the engine itself was unreliable. Head gasket failures, cold start issues, poor longevity. Buyers expecting serene luxury were handed a car that felt like it belonged in a tractor pull. Inside, the plush velour seats and wood grain trim clashed with the constant growl of the diesel clatter. Fuel economy was only marginally better than a gas V8, and the performance sacrifice made it hard to justify. The diesel Mark VI was a novelty, and not a good one. It was dropped quietly, almost as if Lincoln hoped everyone would forget it ever existed. And for the most part, they did. It was not just a bad car, it was a bad idea. The 1970 Ford Mustang Boss 302 was a race car in disguise. Built to qualify for Trans-American racing, it had to follow strict engine size rules. But that did not stop Ford from turning it into a legend. With its high-revving 302 cubic inch V8 and close-ratio 4-speed gearbox, the Boss 302 was built to scream. It was not the fastest in a straight line, but that was not the point. It was all about handling, quick corners, tight turns, track precision in a street-ready package. The Boss 302 had a unique look too. Blacked-out hood, bold stripes, rear window slats, and a front chin spoiler that made it look fast just standing still. Inside, it was all business. No frills, just function. It was made for the road, but born for the circuit. And while the Mustang had plenty of wild variations over the years, the Boss 302 stood out as the one that proved muscle could be smart. It was power with discipline, noise with control. Today, it remains one of the most beloved Mustangs ever built, a reminder that true performance does not always come from brute force alone. The Buick. Skyhawk did not scream for attention, but maybe that was the point. When it arrived in the mid-1970s, it aimed to blend European inspiration with American sensibility. It was compact, cleanly styled, and powered by a V6 engine that offered decent pep without guzzling fuel. For Buick, a brand long associated with larger sedans and older buyers, the Skyhawk was something different. It targeted the young professional, the first-time buyer, or anyone who wanted a car that felt a little more modern without breaking the bank. It was not flashy, but it was practical. It had sharp lines, bucket seats, and just enough style to stand apart without being loud. But the Skyhawk's quiet charm worked against it in the long run. It never made a big splash, and when new models and designs arrived, it was quickly forgotten. Still, for those who drove one, it represented a turning point. It was the bridge between tradition and modernity, between the wide-bodied beasts of the past and the sleeker designs of the future. It came and went without much noise, but left a soft, memorable echo. The 1983 Honda Prelude was supposed to usher in a new chapter of Japanese sportiness, but it stumbled at the starting line. This was the first-generation Prelude to reach American shores, and expectations were high. Honda had already built a reputation for quality, value, and clever engineering. But the Prelude, despite its sporty looks and pop-up headlights, lacked the excitement buyers were promised. The engine was weak, the acceleration was slow, and reliability, usually Honda's strongest suit, suffered from teething problems in the new design. Suspension components wore out quickly, interior trim rattled, and while the car handled decently in corners, it felt gutless in straight-line performance. It looked like a sports car. It acted like an underpowered commuter. Competing against more powerful coupes and hot hatches, the Prelude fell flat. It did have its fans, mostly for its futuristic dash and tidy size, but even loyal Honda buyers expected more. Later generations would fix these flaws and turn the Prelude into a beloved icon. But this first outing left a bland impression. Today, the original Prelude is rarely remembered, not because it was terrible, but because it was underwhelming, a rare stumble from a company that usually got it right. The 1971 Plymouth Hemi-Cuda was not just a car. It was a threat on wheels. With its legendary 426 Hemi engine under the hood, it delivered over 400 horsepower with a sound that shook the pavement. It had attitude baked into every inch. The shaker hood screamed aggression before the engine even turned over. The blackout grille, the wild colors, the billboard stripes, all of it said one thing loud and clear. This car was not here to play nice. It was one of the rarest, meanest machines ever built, and only a handful were made, making each one a piece of street-legal treasure. It had a presence that pulled attention like gravity. At car shows or quarter-mile strips, the Hemi-Cuda always stood out. Drivers knew they had something special, and the competition knew it too. But the Cuda was more than muscle. It was a symbol of what American cars once dared to be: loud, fast, and built for no one's approval. Today, it is one of the most sought-after classics on Earth, not just for its speed, but for what it stood for. This was the moment before the rules caught up, when raw power still had the last word. Drop a comment with the weird car feature you miss most, then like the video and subscribe for more rides back in time.